Skepticism towards the EU enlargement, especially concerning Ukraine's accession, frequently emerges in European countries. Russia capitalizes on these sentiments to amplify its destabilizing influence within Europe and its interference into the domestic politics of EU member states. A successful and European aligned Ukraine is an existential threat to the Putin regime. For this reason, Moscow has dedicated significant resources over the many years to disseminate misinformation aimed at discrediting Ukraine and its people within European media. Elections are particularly sensitive periods within the information environment, particularly on social and politically relevant issues, making them vulnerable targets for disinformation campaigns. The first round of the presidential elections in Poland, a country whose support is crucial for Ukraine's successful resistance to Russian aggression and continued progress along the European path, will take place soon, on May 18th. The elections in Poland may present an opportunity for Moscow to discredit the idea of Ukraine's European integration through various lenses: historical memory, current economic hardships, or fear of war. Russia may attempt to insert anti Ukrainian narratives into the Polish information space in order to drive a bridge between two nations. That's why we decided to discuss the key aspects of the upcoming presidential elections in Poland in the context of disinformation threats and the dynamics of Polish Ukrainian relations with Lukasz Adamski, political analyst and deputy director of the Juliusz Mieroszewski Center for Dialogue. Mr. Adamski, is the topic of Ukraine's European integration present in the rhetoric of presidential candidates and other influential politicians in Poland? If so, what concerns about Ukraine's membership are voiced most actively?
Of course, this topic is there. We can say that now, during the presidential campaign in Poland, there are already three main candidates, at least based on the situation we have now at the end of March. We have Rafał Trzaskowski, who is a candidate from Prime Minister Donald Tusk's Civic Coalition Party, and he frankly supports Ukraine's membership in the EU and Ukraine's membership in NATO. And of course, Ukraine must fulfill all the necessary criteria. One way or another, it would be very dangerous for both Ukraine and the EU to accept a country that is not ready to implement part of the so-called acquis communautaire, European legislation. But if Ukraine fulfills the criteria, then, of course, Poland will support Ukraine during the ratification of the EU membership agreement. And by the way, Polish politicians have been following this policy in principle since the late 1990s. For the first time, even though Poland itself was not yet an EU member, it was in a non-paper that was handed over to Western European partners that EU expansion could not end at the Bug River, but should also encompass Ukraine in the future. The second candidate is Karol Nawrocki from Law and Justice. He takes the position that in order for Poland to support Ukraine on its way to the EU, Ukraine must not only fulfill the criteria, this obvious criteria, the Copenhagen criteria, including, of course, the willingness and ability to implement European legislation, but also agree on, resolve and solve certain problematic issues in relations with Poland. And here he means, first of all, the issue that is the most painful for Poles, which is most often mentioned when they are asked about Ukraine. That is the issue of assessing the activities of the OUN-UPA and even more so Ukraine's unconditional readiness to rebury all the victims of the UPA, whose bones are somewhere in the fields, in ditches, or in wells, or at least in graves that have already been forgotten somewhere in Volhynia and Galicia. And this means, from a formal point of view, that Novrotsky adds a certain requirement. Not only the objective criteria for membership in the European Union, but also Ukraine's readiness to resolve historical issues with Poland. And there is a third candidate, a candidate from the Confederation. This is the party that has the most Ukraine skeptical electorate. I'm not saying that it is a pro Russian party, as some journalists in Ukraine often believe, but it is a party with a Ukraine skeptical electorate. To be specific, almost half of the party's electorate are people who view Ukraine with some skepticism or negatively, and only 10% of the electorate are positive. Therefore, it is not surprising that they are the most negative about Ukraine and its future membership in the EU. They say that this could be detrimental to the Polish agricultural sector, to Polish small businesses, and this small business is also a significant voter of this party. Of course, they also talk a lot about history and the cult of Bandera. The candidate of this party, Slavomir Mensen, even visited Lviv on February 24th to take a picture of himself in front of the monument to Stepan Bandera, and thus show himself as a person who protests against this historical narrative and heroes, as they are now very often regarded in Ukraine. And they do not, of course, rule out the possibility of Ukraine's membership in the EU or NATO, but they try to show negative consequences in their election rhetoric. By the way, Novrotsky also says that, for example, we need to weigh the price that the Polish agricultural sector will pay. In fact, many Polish experts believe that Ukraine's membership in the EU will be a great challenge for Poland, because it will entail competition in the agricultural market. It will imply a big difference between the levels of wages, which may mean, for example, that Ukrainian entrepreneurs will enter Poland and compete with Poles with cheap labor. To some extent, these fears also existed at the beginning of the war, but back then, solidarity with Ukraine and the desire to support absolutely outweighed them. That is why this rhetoric is present in the Polish presidential campaign and will continue to be present. Because it is difficult not to have it there, since Ukraine is Poland's neighbor and Ukraine is a factor in Polish domestic political life, and Poland is so connected to Ukraine, both with positive and negative emotions.
What is the reason behind the rise in popularity of right-wing populist forces in Poland? Should Ukraine be concerned about these trends?
Let me start by saying that I don't really like such names as far right, populists, etc., because this is a certain tool, a hammer that we use to hit our political opponents with. And it so happened that in Polish politics, we can say for the last 20 years, there has been a dominance of two large parties, Law and Justice and Civic Platform. Now, after some changes, it is the Civic Coalition of Donald Tusk, the leader of the Civic Coalition, and Jarosław Kaczynski, the leader of Law and Justice. I might remind the Ukrainian listeners that Kaczynski was prime minister from 2005 to 2007, and his brother was president until 2010 when he tragically died. Then there was the 8-year rule of Donald Tusk. Then 8 years of law and justice, and now we have Donald Tusk's government again. And now imagine that you are 20 or 30 years old, you don't like Kaczynski and you don't like Tusk. You're looking for alternatives. And the only alternative is confederation because other parties have either already cooperated with Kaczynski or with Tusk. In addition, Confederation is a party of young people or between the young and middle generations. On the contrary, Law and Justice and the Civic Platform have a lot of politicians from the older generation. And this gives a natural answer, as you said, to the question of why Confederation is so popular. Because young people often vote for them. Because a lot of people want an alternative. They're looking for alternatives to the two existing big parties. And only the Confederation has not been in government for the last 20 years. For example, imagine a situation where Ukraine has had either Poroshenko, Zelensky, Tymoshenko, or Yushchenko for 20 years. People want alternative. And the fact that this is a right-wing ideology, I said that for me, the Confederation, if it is a right-wing party, is a very modern, unifying party, which, for example, is not socially oriented, but rather focused on the young and liberal electorate in terms of economics. It also pays quite a lot of attention to rights, to the traditional family model, contrary to the woke ideology, which is popular in Western Europe and also has its own supporters in Poland. Young men often vote for the Confederation because they believe that they are discriminated against in Poland. That is, there are many reasons, and they are not related at all to what I often hear in the Ukrainian media, that this is a pro-Russian or anti-Ukrainian party. This does not play a role for people who, in my opinion, decide to vote for this or that party.
In your opinion, are there real threats of foreign information influence in the course of Poland's presidential elections?
Is there any influence of Russian disinformation in Poland? Yes, there is. But the Poles are inoculated with Russian imperialism because of history. And there is very little, I would say, pro-Russian position here. Perhaps a few percent. Instead, there is a larger electorate, much larger than pro-Russian, which I consider to be Ukraine skeptical. According to our social surveys that we did at the end of the year, we, meaning the Miroshevsky Center, an institution of which I am the director. So in December, we conducted a large sociological survey of Poles. And it turned out that almost 30% of Poles now have a negative opinion of Ukrainians, only 23% have a positive one. The rest are neutral. This does not mean that there is a lack of readiness to support Ukraine in the war against the Russian aggressor, but it does mean that we must, of course, work to reduce the percentage of Ukraino-skeptics. But why do these Ukraino-skeptics exist? Because they have certain claims regarding Ukraine, and these claims are sometimes objective, and sometimes they can find them in pro-Russian narratives or anti-Ukrainian narratives that are spread on social media. Polish youth, after all, not only Polish youth, but young people in general, have a lot of problems with critical thinking, with understanding what is verified information and what is disinformation. And here too we can talk quite a bit about the reasons for this state of affairs, namely the influence of modern technologies, the internet, the lack of the habit of reading long texts, and the smaller program load in schools. I would say more time, greater affluence of society, which of course negatively affects such ambitions to read and get an education as much as possible, because this will increase the chances of a good job later. And this phenomenon, I would say, this susceptibility of young people to the influence of unverified information is used by those who spread false information about Ukraine. I'm sure that at least some of those anti Ukrainian slogans are Russian disinformation. And here we can only pay tribute to the Russians for realizing that there is no point in persuading Poles to love the Moscow Empire, but rather to take the existing problems in relations between Poland and Ukraine, and or the problems that ordinary Poles face in their contacts with Ukrainian immigrants or refugees. And these can be such things as, for example, smoking in stairwells. And this is absolutely prohibited in Poland, but unfortunately, some people do it in Ukraine. This then affects the image of the whole nation through the mechanism of hasty generalization, and this is how these pro Russian narratives work.
One of the possible ways to settle the Russian-Ukrainian war involves deploying European contingents to ensure security. If Polish military personnel will be deployed on Ukrainian territory after the signing a peace agreement, what impact would this development have on support for Ukraine among Poles?
There were actually several questions. I'll start with the last one. It all depends on the conditions under which Polish soldiers, Polish units, should be stationed in Ukraine. And we do not know those conditions because there is no ceasefire. And we are not even sure yet whether the truce that is being talked about so much will actually take place. Poland, you need to understand, is a frontline country. We have a border not only with Ukraine, but also with Belarus, which is actually part of Russia's military space, and with Russia itself through the Kaliningrad Oblast. And we also understand that due to natural conditions, namely the existence of a large lowland that stretches between Moscow, then through the Smolensk Gate, Minsk, Berestia, and Warsaw, Poland is a very convenient target for a Russian offensive from a geographical point of view. And if the Russians were to attack Poland, then of course the Baltic states would be in Russia's arms very easily uh, if Russia were to manage to deal with Poland. Then Lithuania or Latvia would fall into Moscow's hands like a plum into a compote. Therefore, there is a possibility of war. And moreover, the Russians have not forgotten the role of Poland in the first weeks and months of the full-scale war, when Poland gave so much equipment to Ukraine and mobilized its allies so much that it made the course of Russian operations very difficult. In some ways, Poland, I don't know if it saved Ukraine, but it probably saved Ukraine significantly at that moment. And the Russians, like the Ukrainians, Poles, and Russian elites are also immersed in history. They have also known for a long time that Poland, the wars that were fought with Poland, which were several wars, were usually about which civilization or which state, which civilization, which space Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus should be part of. In the 19th century, the Russians argued for the need to keep Poland, which had no statehood at the time, under Russian political control precisely because they said that if we were not in Warsaw, if we did not teach the Poles order and respect for Russian power, the Poles would want to take Kiev and maybe even Smolensk. And so, given this tradition of Russian political thought, it seems to me quite likely that if a full scale war between Russia and NATO breaks out, and such an outbreak could happen either through targeted aggression on the part of Russia or through an accident. Let's say the Russians wanted to test NATO's Article 5, make some kind of provocation, then the escalation mechanism, the so called escalation ladder, will start functioning and NATO will find itself at war with Russia. Then Poland will be under attack under the first blow. That's why the Polish political elite, realizing this and also understanding the skepticism of Poles themselves about sending soldiers to Ukraine, has not yet promised to send those troops. Perhaps this will change after the presidential election. I don't know, but for now, Poland wants to limit its assistance to Ukraine through the maintenance of this huge hub, a military hub in Rzeszów, through support with ammunition and military equipment, but not through sending soldiers.
What would you advise Ukraine regarding communication with Polish civil society and media in order to minimize the impact and spread of anti Ukrainian narratives? Under what circumstances could the blockade of the Polish Ukrainian border be resumed?
First of all, Ukraine should know Poland. That is, Ukrainian experts and journalists should know and understand Poland, and not to treat Poland as one of the EU countries or as one of Ukraine's neighbors, but as a country that has its own very specific attitude towards Ukraine. Attitude where there are a lot of positive emotions. And these positive emotions further push the Polish elite to support Ukraine. But there are also negative emotions. And therefore, this is also a country with its own political processes that are not black and white. That is, all the problems in Polish Ukrainian relations should not be seen as the influence of Russian agents, provocations, etc. Unfortunately, I see this tendency very often among Ukrainian journalists, often even among experts. And an open question here is how many analysts there are in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian administration, or in Ukrainian think tanks, for example, who specialize in Poland, who would work on a daily basis only to provide the Ukrainian government with objective information about the social and political processes taking place in Poland. There are probably more than 10 people in Poland who work every day. Before the war, it was a dozen or more, and now there are probably a few dozen. But before the war, there were more than a dozen people, either at the Center of Eastern Studies or at the Polish Institute of International Affairs or perhaps at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who were only researching what was happening in Ukraine. And this is a policy of having a certain picture of knowledge which can differ significantly from the reports, from the information in the media. As far as I know, there are no such people in Ukraine. There are certain experts who specialize, for example, in security issues, in Ukraine's European integration, in Central and Eastern Europe, but there are no such experts on Poland specifically. So the first advice is to invest in the knowledge of experts. And we need to have narrow specialists, country-specific experts. The second piece of advice is to avoid hasty generalizations. I often saw, when the protests were going on, that the Ukrainian media, even the leading ones, wrote, for example, that the Poles were blocking the border or that the Poles were pouring out Ukrainian grain. You see, not Poles. Just representatives of, for example, a trade union, one of the Polish trade unions of Polish farmers, or, for example, representatives of a trade union of companies operating in the field of transportation. But not all Poles. After all, this mechanism exists, unfortunately, in Poland as well. I see such news headlines as Ukrainians glorify Bandera, or Ukrainians do not allow reburial of our descendants. This is absolutely harmful. It is destructive for the perception of one country by the neighboring people. That is, to avoid these hasty generalizations and to avoid excessive emotions in general. I understand that there is a war in Ukraine, and emotions are somewhat natural. And it is very difficult to overcome the mechanisms of psychology. But usually, at least in Western Europe, if someone argues without referring to some kind of objective picture, but to emotions, especially if they use emotional blackmail, or at least describe reality in overly emotional words, it is perceived, perhaps with the exception of Southern Europe, where Italians are also emotional, or Greeks. But at least in Poland, not to mention the UK or Germany, it is perceived as frivolity. If someone is overly emotional, then they are not a serious interlocutor because they cannot explain certain things properly and they have not analyzed the situation objectively. And so, for example, if Ukrainian delegations come and talk to the Polish government about resolving the issue of the border blockade at the Polish-Ukrainian border crossings, or, for example, resolving the issue of transportation, then when the Polish officials hear something about the grain genocide, and this situation happened, there were accusations behind the scenes about the grain genocide, that Poland was committing some genocide. Well, it is perceived, as like we're not talking to serious people. Or there is an influential online newspaper in Ukraine that wrote an editorial saying that Poland is waging a war against Ukraine. Waging a war against the European future of Ukraine. And again, this mechanism of excessive emotionality means that any comment that are then written by people who give such headlines, even if they are absolutely reasonable and correct, will be perceived through that excessive emotionality. That's why I'm given advice that can be implemented without excessive financial resources. It's just a matter of how you communicate. Avoid emotions. And finally, the issue of borders. Of course, the blockade on the borders was something that objectively harmed Ukraine's interests. It was difficult to ban these blockades. I'm not saying that it was impossible, but it was difficult because Poland has such a holy tradition of freedom. If someone wants to protest, they simply go to the local community, to the mayor, and give information that they will organize a protest on such and such days. If there are no serious objections for security reasons, etc., then the local authorities are obliged to grant such permission for protests. The fact that the border and border strips were not included in the list of border infrastructure where protests are not allowed was probably a mistake on Poland's part, particularly given the context that Ukraine is at war against Poland's enemy. But here again, there is another thing. The Polish authorities were probably afraid to introduce such a step during the parliamentary campaign. So again, I understand the emotions of Ukrainians, which are associated with the border blockade, but this border blockade was primarily directed against the EU or against Brussels policies, not against Ukraine. And this farmer who has loans was not interested in what Ukrainians would think of his protests. He was interested in the fact that he had the ability to pay those loans. And he believed that the so-called green system that the European Commission was proposing could make it more difficult for him to do business. As for the grain spillage, maybe I can say a few words about that. This is a very interesting example because the act of pouring out grain caused a wave of indignation and emotions among Ukrainians, who later said that this reminded them of the Holodomor, of disrespect for the most sacred thing, that is bread, and that Ukrainian farmers are harvesting this grain in fields that are mined. They sometimes lose their own lives when harvesting grain, and then the Poles spill out this grain. And this was perceived as disrespectful to Ukraine. As far as I know, Polish farmers, they always or very often perform such protests. It happened 20 years ago when they poured German grain out of railroad cars. It's just that very same attitude as of Ukrainians was in Poland probably in the 19th century, and now it has changed. I don't like these grain throwing actions at all. But what I lacked was the same ability of Ukrainian commentators to look at these events a little more coldly, to understand the motivation of, for example, those farmers, and to comment on everything with less emotion. Because then the public mood in Poland and in Ukraine gets inflamed this way. And in both countries, we have a tendency to deteriorate attitude and sentiment toward the other nation, both in Ukraine and in Poland. In Ukraine, of course, the general attitude toward Poles is warmer, and the attitude of Poles toward Ukrainians is colder, but the trend is negative on both sides.
The interview was complied with the support of the European Union and the International Renaissance Foundation within the framework of European Renaissance of Ukraine project. Its content is exclusive responsibility of the authors and does not necessarily reflect the views of the European Union and the International Renaissance Foundation.